Welcome, everyone, to the closing reception and Meet the Artist of Reflections. Reflection, that show in this series of exhibitions that I curated that are online for Rhombus Space. And each show related to a season, and this one is winter, sort of internal worlds reflecting kind of a quieter but really profound sensibility to the work. The first show was spring and it was growth. The second show was intensity, summer. The third show was bounty for fall. And this one seemed like a really nice exhibition as a way to kind of reflect on the whole series, but also to deal with work that both is reflective, maybe formally in compositional structures, but also in a working method for you as the artist and in the way that we experience it. And I thought it was really interesting. I just posted the last image for the show on Instagram, and it's Katherine Keltner's piece. And as soon as I put it up, I was like, wow, it's with this streak of yellow. It's a blue painting with a streak of yellow. And immediately it was like a Ukrainian painting. And it was, that's what's so magical about art, is that we make things that are profound and resonate on this deeper level and often have a sort of premonition to what's coming down the line. And so for me, posting the image, I didn't say anything about the image because I didn't want to reframe its original intention. But, people are having a bit of a hard time talking about the arts during a time when there's this global crisis. And so how do we respect creative endeavors and, find value and see value and engage as a community, even when things are really difficult simultaneously. And so I think that of all of the shows, of all the series of shows that I've curated, this one has like the most sort of depth and thoughtfulness to it. So I'm excited to go through it. I'd like everyone just to introduce yourselves, and I will speak a little bit about the entire show, and then we can go through the exhibition.
I'm Katherine Keltner. I'm based in Brooklyn, and my studio's in kind of on the Red Hook Gowanus border. Right now I'm really making paintings. I always like drawing and line. I've made an artist book. I've done some installations, but right now I'm really pretty enmeshed in painting.
Hi, I'm Tom Kotik. I consider myself a sculptor. That's what I sort of studied and worked on in school and have done public art projects. I did a couple things at Socrates and things like that in the past. In the past few years, though, I've been doing these large-scale wall murals, which I consider sort of flat sculptures in a way. I mean, I do think of them sculpturally. I think of them as objects in space transferred at architectural scale. So they're very graphic. My work has a very graphic edge to it, whether it's sculpture or two-dimensional work. I all think of it as the same thing. And I'm inspired by sound and visualizing sound, especially visualizing sound without sound, like kind of a way for the viewer to add a musical idea or a sound idea to a sort of platter that I'm presenting visually. And I've just started working with an architect in the Czech Republic on a large, I guess you could say, mural / sculpture for a building that he's designing outside of Prague. So that's kind of a new exciting avenue for my work to go down, because I've always, my work, if you see, it's very geometric and architectural to begin with. So this is
Yeah.
a really nice melding of architecture and my sensibility visually together. So I'm really excited about that. So
Is that
that's
for an interior wall or exterior wall?
oh, actually an exterior wall. It's going to be over 100 feet long. It's basically like my geometric shapes floating in space to a imaginary soundtrack, but cut into the side of a wall through metal paneling. So I will send you an image of that at some point, so you can, or come by the studio.
Hi, my name is Colin O'Con. I'm a painter, sculptor, musician. And I'm in Holmes, New York, upstate, about an hour and a half north of the city. I was in Brooklyn for until 2016. I'm originally from Louisiana. And my work is mostly nature-based, mostly out of my head, reflecting on things that I've seen and gathering images from all over the place. And, definitely Louisiana and the South, that kind of Southern Gothic sensibility definitely creeps into my work.
I am Laura Frantz. I'm primarily a painter. I work out of Brooklyn as well. I'm in Prospect Lefferts Gardens and have a studio in this neighborhood. And my work has been, I really liked the theme reflection because I thought it was so perfect for the way I think about painting, which I think of a lot of as this kind of call and response where you make a move and then you respond to the move within the painting. And think about what to do next. Like, I've never been able to plan out my work, which I would love to be able to do. I think that would be so comforting. But I feel like often there's this like process of putting something down and then trying to figure out what the next thing should be based on what's there.
Brian, go ahead.
Hi, Katerina. Thank you for inviting us into this great show and for this tonight. I'm primarily a painter. I started as a painter and always loved painting, and also have explored, especially in my early career, filmmaking, made films for a few years and worked with, but again, filmmaking coming from from a painter's head. Also photography, I worked with photographs in different ways for different periods and combining them with painting. And but in recent years, I've been working just with painting and with drawing, both. And like Laura, I work in a very similar way where I don't plan images, paintings. They don't, I find that just doesn't work for me. So it always starts with a kind of bodily response to what's occurring as I'm making the first marks. And then there tends to be this kind of strange thing where all of a sudden, quite quickly, images start to cohere, start to build. And then I feel like it's my job really to kind of bring that up into being. And it's as if there's a direction that the painting takes. It's like kind of almost a teleology of the painting that pulls it forward. So I'm very, very interested in that. And the theme of this show, the title of this show, Reflection, I'm very, very interested in inner work. But not inner work is separated from looking out, how somehow that continuum is a continuum of depth in both directions. So that's kind of the space I'm always trying to find in the work, where it feels deeply inward, but at the same time, it's looking way outward. So, and everything, all the steps in between. So I've worked in New York City for many years, but for the last decade or so, I've been working more and more upstate. And then once COVID came, moved the studio really up here. So I'm working up, and it's up about half an hour north of Hudson, near Chatham, New York.
Reflection was an online exhibition presented during the pandemic.
It's on the landing page. And this is, as I'd said, the fourth and final installment of these sort of quarterly seasonal shows. And what's interesting is that, like what Brian was just saying about the deep inner world reflecting the outer world, there is like, that's a sort of emotional, conceptual symmetry. And there's a lot of mirroring and symmetry in the actual work itself. But I feel that there's a very strong intuitive kind of energy throughout, the works in the show. They're not as, technical process driven, or there isn't kind of like this intense technique or like a single direction in the work, but there's a lot of pushing back and forth, pulling back and forth in the work. And it's interesting because it sort of operates, because it's so intuitive, the work in the show, it operates less in a linguistic area. So it's kind of hard to talk about. But I think it's really interesting to hear everybody's way of how they negotiate, how you all negotiate your studio process. And Tom, when you bring up the issue of sound and music, and Colin, also you're influenced by sort of your work with music and your interest and love of music, that there's that, it's also a non-linguistic expression, right? And one of the originators of abstraction, Vasily Kandinsky, was super inspired by major operatic performances and how music could transcend sort of everyday experience, and wanted to bring that into abstraction and into visual art, and explore the idea of synesthesia, of having this crossover between the senses. So I feel like, again, this sort of crossover with the senses, but it's not like necessarily tied to a linguistic field, so it could be audio, visual, sensorial. So then entering the exhibition, what I was thinking is we'll start, I'll pause and enlarge, and then we can just hear from each artist about the individual pieces. So Brian, if you wouldn't mind speaking about this one.
Sure. As you pointed out, it's actually really difficult to talk about the specifics of meaning and so on in this kind of way of working. So I'll kind of talk around it. First of all, this is a very small sized piece. So I've got it here actually. So you can see. Not very big. In my studio work, I tend to work back and forth between large scale works like the one that's behind here, that's 6 by 8 feet, to really small works. This is 10 inches by 12 inches. But the size changed, but I'm very interested in the way the scale moves through these pieces. The experience of this, to me anyway, is that it actually has a large scale within the small size of it. And I'm fascinated with how one brings those differences up. With a big piece like back here, there's a lot of body response, full body response. And then as you move into, you get more and more and more into the kind of visual experience. It becomes much more particular. So, what can I say? You were talking about language, just my general way of working. I feel that I am attending to the surface and the materials and so on in a space, in a kind of psychological and emotional space that actually comes just before language. I'm really, really interested in language. I love poetry. I read all the time. I'm very, very interested in language structures, but I am more interested in the actual image that comes before we move into a discursive kind of thought. And in my own investigations of my own mind, I actually realized that, at least in my own process, that there's a kind of sensing or feeling that happens. Then there's a flash of image, and then a word comes. It's like, you know, all the time. I mean, that's the way it functions. So for me, I want to get into that space just before it starts to cohere into a kind of rational language structure, which doesn't mean that they are irrational. It's more that they're just kind of pre-rational or pre-linguistic. So I can't, it's very hard to talk about that.
It's interesting because the way you're describing that pre-linguistic state, I think it's apparent in the definition of some of the edges in the forms, you know, so you have this very intentional contouring and edge definition, and then you have sort of the like echoing elements that really emphasize an intentional separation between positive negative space and like definition, but then the form, it slips from like a recognizable state, you know. So I think it translates, like what you're saying translates in the formal technicality of the composition and the individual elements.
Great. I mean, I've always said that the action in painting is in the transitions. It's in how an artist handles the transitions to form, color, space, and so on. And that's what actually creates space. And every artist handles that differently. And so thanks for pointing that out. I mean, those edge movements, and they're handled differently in different works and different parts of a particular work, where sometimes it will be very linear, sometimes it won't. It'll be the color will mix across, and yet the space starts to define in that way. So, you know, for me, that keeps bringing it back into this sense of feeling rather than a sense of, I'm not in any way making an illustration of my mind. Like, I don't have this image and then paint it out. And I'm not seeing some image that I then am kind of copying the internal, my mind or something outside. I'm more interested in trying to find a way that you use the word slippage, that stuff is constantly constructing and deconstructing itself all the time. So there's this kind of pulsing feeling of movement, change, and also things become fixed, become like objects.
Great, thank you. Go on. And Laura mentioned it feels a little bit like primordial soup. This is Albert St. Weaver's work, but actually Katherine has known Albert for a really long time. Katherine, do you want to say a few things and then I'll add to it?
I've known Albert for, I've lost count, but like 15 years or, you know, something a long time. And he's always been, first I'll say he's a surfer. And I say that because I think it reflects his persona too. He's very patient. He'll, you know, like a surfer will wait for a wave. He waits to sort of get to the right place. He's fairly soft-spoken and thoughtful, and I think his work reflects that a lot. When I first knew him, he pretty much always had a horizon line in his work, and he's scaled away from that. But his surfaces have always been pretty heavily worked, but very gentle looking, like they're carefully sanded. And you can see a little bit of push and pull between some earlier layers and what's left. And my interpretation of his work has always been some sort of natural moment, whether, I don't know if it's a sky or an ocean, but without specifically naming it, just something that we feel like is out there.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the surfer aspect, because I do think that that's a big part of his identity and his, there's sort of like, surfers have to give up power and control to the ocean, and there's sort of kind of go, you have to literally go with the flow, like you can't fight it, and it takes, you know, repetitive practice and movement and like getting up again and getting thrown down again and catching a wave. And there's a certain also euphoria when you catch the waves that I think that he's looking for in this, like this sort of perfect pitch, this perfect moment. And so in these pieces, some of his earlier works have these sort of buildup of graphite or buildup of wave lines. And here he's almost like waxing a surfboard, getting the perfect touch on this by pulling the material on and pushing it on and pulling it off. It's like really about the patina, but in a way that's not, it's not in one direction, you know, it's not just additive. Okay, Tom.
These are sound studies. I call them sound studies. And I kind of mentioned that I do these graphic works that are geometric, and I think of them as objects floating through space with their own soundtrack, kind of their own kind of, I think of it as a very neutral kind of droney soundtrack, but think of, you know, almost like the soundtrack is like a brine that they're in, or these things that have a life of their own to a soundtrack. And I like, you know, I didn't think about this, Katerina, but I really do think now about the intuitive nature of these. And I'm thinking about sort of what we think of as intuitive. To me, I guess the first thing I think of with intuitive is this sort of very loose and very organic kind of way of making something. But I'm very tight and very geometric, and yet I consider this very intuitive as well. It's not like an illustration of a thing, it's an illustration of an idea, but it's a thing too. And again, I don't have a plan necessarily, although I do a lot of preparatory sketches in my work. Perhaps that's the architectural thinking. I you know, I have studied some architectural history. I've always been really interested in architecture, and there's kind of a practice within architecture to sketch, you know, until you come up with that thing. So I do work in that way. So this intuitive process is born out through all this sketching, and then I come to these studies. You know, I started making these more geometric studies back about 2014, 13, and I really like the idea of the rhythm within the rhythm within the rhythm. That's why I've broken these up into 3 panels. Like Brian's piece, this is not actually a very big piece. These are only about 16 by 16, something like that, inches, that is. But they do think they are kind of in a monumental scale internally, or the way I think of them. And I think I've kind of transferred these ideas to these large scale murals I've been doing recently. Again, it's very intuitive. I think of the color arrangements in a kinetic way, like sound is a wave. I think of color as a wave, and so I'm kind of combining those two practices, or those two ways of looking at waves. And I tend to work with very bright colors, or colors that have an electric charge with each other. I do play electric music, you know, I play rock and roll and things like that. And so electricity and sound have a really important connection for me. So I try to work with colors that have an electric relationship to each other. So yeah, that's just some thoughts about the work.
The color combination you've chosen, the values are really similar, but the colors are fairly different, though still compatible in a cool range. And it does create that visual vibration, or
well, you know, it's kind of like synesthesia in a way. It's like color replaces sound, so you kind of place the sound with a color. And again, you know, we use the word tonality for both visual arts and music. Like there is some kind of like
Yeah.
genetic relation between the waves that are hitting us, whether they're, color waves or sound waves. So I'm really interested in that relationship too.
And I appreciate what you said about a rhythm within a rhythm and how the white areas provide sort of a silent break or like a little tempo in there, but the form has a continuity.
Yeah, I've done a similar piece to this in like 16 feet by 16 feet at a gallery in Prague, and it was really interesting to see those divisions at that scale, at the architectural scale.
This is Barry Gerson's. Brian, you are familiar with Barry's work. Seems like, do you want to say a little bit about?
Yeah, I'm sorry Barry can't be here tonight. He's a very, very interesting artist. Years ago, when I was very young and I was making films, I really looked up to Barry. Barry was a kind of hero of mine, actually. He was making these non-narrative independent films that were so rich and full of feeling. And they actually had a kind of, for me, because I was also, when I was young making music, and they felt having that vibration of that kind of rich vibration of music that can hold so much meaning with the incredible brilliance of visual, light forms. And he was somehow putting that together, and they were very, very moving works of art. I feel like he and I appreciate each other's work because we're trying to find a way to get the work to be touching many, many different aspects of the self and one's experience. And I feel like he's able to do that with these movies. Some of these films are very, very long too, so that you get into a demeditative kind of space with them.
So these are like primarily filmed from nature, like they're brooks and things, or does he draw from like natural phenomenon as part of his aesthetic?
Yeah, but not only that. I mean, there's a lot of his work is inside of houses and buildings and structures that are, industrial structures, all kinds of stuff. So, and the works that we're seeing here are actually combining more than one image. Yeah, this is like from some sort of a culvert-like thing.
And this one has no sound.
Yeah, and these are excerpts, short excerpts of much longer works.
So they do have that both literal reflection of the split picture plane, but also the reflection of shadows and light and form.
Are these shot on video or film, 16 millimeter?
I think these are shot on video. All of his early work was shot on 16 millimeter film. But I believe these were shot on video, and they were certainly edited on video in this way.
But there is a little bit of that, it's just on the edge of recognizable. Like it's a culvert, but it's so disoriented in terms of the direction and the angle.
Yeah, exactly. And they kind of spin off into these metaphoric spaces that don't lock into the literal representation.
Right. To me, I love how he has, very clean, limited palette that gets repeated. And so like the blue on the outside comes through on the blue gray. There's a lot of aesthetic sensitivity to
Yeah.
the forms and colors, and a lot of great textures too. He has a Vimeo site with a bunch of excerpts, and they're sort of these captivating aesthetic meditations on shape, form, and pattern.
Similar to what Laura and Brian have said, I also work very much back and forth to what I put down and then react to that, maybe pull it forward, push it back. So usually I'll start with a very, very loose sketch, like just a form or a very rough composition, just a few lines. Partially because, well, I don't want to be wedded to anything, but I also don't want to just greet a blank canvas. I need something that I can sort of talk to, as it were. My work has always been interested in nature, or even just what is left behind, whether it's detritus or little pieces of notes from someone's life or something. And I'm interested in sort of taking what is and then the bump up of some sort of system or order against that. And I guess that's sort of a nice segue back to what Katerina was saying. I think she was tempted to, probably because of the color, say something about Ukraine in this. And I made this before the current war that was going on, before I had realized there was some sort of crisis. But I do have a hope in my work that there's enough openness that many people can find something that they need in it, which I think goes to the idea of reflection, that I don't want to direct someone so much so that they're looking at exactly what I tell them, but there's this idea of a little bit more universality, that there are a lot of ways in to a work, and maybe it can provide different things for different people. What else? I guess my recent work uses a figure, or a figure from nature, the leaf form, more directly than I've ever used like an image, which has been, that's kind of fun. And most of my paintings, you can probably see, have a lot of layers, or let's say other paintings underneath it. I'm really not afraid of putting something, I'm not afraid of like ruining a painting. I'm not afraid of putting something down and not being able to continue to go back into it. And I really, really like the sort of past lives that become visible, and the ones that I don't want, I can cross out or push away a little bit. And then ultimately I try to bring one or a couple of things forward so that the work reads as flat. So while there are a lot of layers, I'm not actually interested in or really preoccupied by depth. I like the flatness.
Yeah, you achieve that with the bands of magenta and some of the white that helps sort of flatten the image. And it's interesting, your work there's sort of like a meandering, almost soothing quality. Like it's like you are also pulled along with what it wants to become, like in Brian's work, but there's like it's like a denser intensity in this.
Yeah.
I think because of the transparency of the layers and the looseness of some of the underdrawing. It's like, it feels like we witnessed you sort of figuring it out too. And there's something, it's like the revealing nature of the layers is there's something very disarming about it, you know? and sort of there's like something soothing, and maybe it's also the cool tones, like those all the blues has that a little bit. There's like a light, airy coolness to it. Interesting. Yeah, I didn't mean to corner it into the Ukraine conflict, but it was amazing to me when I pulled it up this morning. I was like, oh yeah, like it just is totally, it's
Yeah.
so empathic. There's a lot of empathy in this work, and it's like totally unintentional, but it just like hits the mark in a wild way today, for me at least.
Oh, that's nice. No, I think that actually goes to the concept behind this exhibition that you've organized, this idea that there's room in these works for people to reflect.
So I chose this painting because I thought, I don't know, I was thinking about reflection in a lot of ways with this one. There's a really obvious reflection built into the structure, the visual structure of the painting with these two different parts. This is a painting where, like, I know Brian was talking about this, but I started off with something very intuitive and was building these brush marks. And this is actually the second version of a painting I made a while back. And I remember a friend of mine calling it my bird shit painting, like in a nice way. But I was excited about the colors of pigeons and bird shit and thinking about windows and frames. And I just got really into this area up above, where there were these kind of like forms that had all these gestures and marks and emanations. And then I thought about some of those, how I could build those same forms, but have them be gentle and almost like vibrations or soft, or like droplets on water. You can have some of the same visual forms or almost like phenomena that repeat throughout a painting, but in very different registers. Thinking about music also. So a lot of my work comes from, I feel like I work best when I'm working both from observation and from my my reflection on, sorry, not imagination, from observation and then reflecting on what I've seen and what I took with me from what I've seen. So I think this was a painting that came from thinking about really epic natural spaces from the perspective of a really small, cramped New York style window where I'm looking out, kind of like where I am now, I'm looking out through and between all these buildings to get a glimpse of like sky or a little bit of trees in the wintertime. And
yeah, I was wondering about the like cinching in by your horizon line, or that horizontal division, how it comes in. Like I keep on looking at those little sort of triangular negative spaces. I'm so intrigued. But when you talk about,
I think with those, I'm almost thinking of the entire, like the picture plane being like an object, or like playing with the idea that it can become this almost like a physical object as well. I'm interested in how things change when you frame them or tape them off, or introduce these really like sharp borders and lines onto something that was free and gestural, and have that visual tension.
yeah, it's really interesting. And I also like that, the idea of like looking out of a New York City window, like looking for, that corner of light. Because it does, you feel sort of cinched in when you look at this, but it's also sort of elegant. It's like hourglass-ish. Intriguing. Elisa, can you just introduce yourself a little bit and talk about your piece for us?
Hi, my name's Elisa, and I am a sculptor, and I also draw. And this is a ceramic piece, I think, from 2019 or 2020, 2019. And in these works, I'm using broken parts of former work that I break up and then use those parts and put them back together in a new piece. And so I am working with the format of the grid in this one and the cube. And I'm like building also squares around these broken parts and also using aluminum leaf to also continue with that idea of repairing. That it comes with the theme of the Japanese tradition of kintsugi, of like repairing broken parts and then using luster. But I'm using an aluminum leaf instead because it's a more kind of affordable way of, luster's an expensive glaze, and I use this aluminum leaf because it's non-precious and but still in this like kind of repairing mode of putting back together these broken parts and then forming this container. I often make containers or vessels, and this vessel's in the shape of a cube, and I only made 2 of this series, but I often think wanting to sort of go back to that sort of shape. And in this work I also inscribe and draw into the wet clay the grid lines in between the different various squares as a way to also join and integrate all the forms that are kind of making the structure of the ceramic piece.
Yeah, you're reiterating the cube and the squares several times in different forms, 2D and 3D.
So I think this piece relates to the theme because the aluminum is shiny and reflective, and I used it for a few years, but then kind of stopped using it as much because it sort of felt a little bit decorative. But still, I'm still sort of wanting to also like go back to that, the use of the reflective material because of how it kind of like joins and integrates a work in a way that makes the surface like kind of come together.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think that we have the back of it here.
Yeah, and you can see in this the broken bits of ceramic that are embedded into the surface. And in this one I like made it up to a certain point and then let it dry a little, and then it sort of then added the top part with the wet clay, and it kind of curves inward a little bit. So there's this idea of time also in the piece, of that I didn't make it all at once. It kind of came together in different phases.
Colin, thank you. And Colin, please.
Yeah, this is my piece. I think this is from 2019. Small painting, 8x10. I was working really small at the time. I'd mostly worked large and medium, and I started to make a lot of smaller ones at the time, around this time. And while my work comes out of the tradition of the sublime and kind of about the collision of nature and the representations of and our various encounters with and my personal encounters with. But I work all out of my head. I use images sometimes as kind of a launch pad into an inner place. And much like Laura said and Brian said, I get something down and start reacting basically until I start building something that comes into some sort of representational form. You know, I'm always using the horizon line. That's my crutch. But building layers and layers, and I like to play with scale and light a lot, and a heightened sense of awareness, a heightened sense of color. And that definitely relates to my music experiences and playing as well. And that, like Tom, I play electric and acoustic music, but you're always adding things onto that and making lots of recordings. You know, we're always making heightened things. We're always adding stuff to recordings, whether it's EQ, compression, effects. And I feel like painting, I paint the same way, where I start and then I start layering and building and building and building this thing to some kind of crescendo that finally coalesces into something that hopefully gives this feeling back, you know. So that's really where this stuff kind of comes from for me.
Yeah, and the colors are so vibrant. And it's interesting as you talk about the sound or the crescendo, like I see it even in the forms, you know, not just in the layering.
Yeah.
Even from left to right, there's this sort of, you know, a crescendo going on.
And a lot of times my paintings would change heavily because I do washes over them, change them. And this one I think I made really quickly. It just kind of, I'll work on a lot of paintings at once too. I don't just work on one, and I don't work on one thing. I'll be working on some paintings, some sculptures, some music, kind of all together. And I kind of roam around. And I do a little bit, and then I go over here and I do a little bit. And then while I'm looking, I'm listening, or I'm thinking about this other thing. And it all kind of is just this big stew that's brewing, you know, all the time around me.
Yeah. Well, you know, for some artists, it's a very alchemical process. And I find that it helps me to have in my own studio practice, because then I don't get fixated on something. I can like just let it sort of like the solution emerges to whatever.
It will kind of reveal itself eventually.
Yeah.
I get stuck that way, where I'd work on one big painting for a really long time, and a lot of time just sitting there and then not getting anywhere. And it's like realizing that, okay, I need to have multiple things happening so that I can keep progressing, and not just being fixated, like you said, on one thing. You know?
Yeah. Well, because creativity is both like purpose, intention, but then also openness, curiosity, and looseness. And it's hard to balance those two. Okay. And we're hearing from, and we can go a little quicker for the second set of paintings, since we've heard about people's general methodologies, but I'm really curious to hear what you guys have to say. So Brian.
Well, this painting it was a little bit different. It started in better here, I'll show you the slide. It actually started with a very particular feeling. I was starting to work and having this get on this really this intense fantasy of what when the bunch of hominids around making ritual sounds and music and getting into rhythmic sounds, and then when suddenly in somebody's mouth this breath formed into a word, and suddenly meaning was there, and that this group would experience that. And I was imagining how the joy of that, and so that's where this thing came from, and it responds to the title, this kind of uprushing of intensity and feeling, but also it ends in a word that is actually structure and form, and it is able to reflect back meaning. And then that led me to thoughts about Genesis. I mean, that's the same story, where the spirit moves across the face of the deep, but it's not until it becomes the word, right? The word is what separates the darkness from the light, and the structure is form, and all of a sudden everything then comes from that. So I was ruminating on that, and the kind of paradox of how I don't work with language, but yet language, that right on that edge of language is really important to what I do. So that's what this is about.
Yeah, I don't know if it came up when we were talking before, but this piece and the way you're talking about made me think of William Blake's work and the sort of the expansive radiating forms around some of his drawings and imagery, sort of on fire, but it's not literal fire, it's like spiritual or revelation. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
there's definitely a lot of it's so your work is so intense, and like even the physicality of it translates that.
well, when I encountered Romanticism, it changed. Like I felt this deep recognition because that move away from the hyper rational into this intensity of feeling. And Blake, I love Blake. It has been very important for me as an artist from when I was really young.
Okay, thank you. This is Albert Sunjan Weaver's work. And here you can see how some of his earlier work did also function on the grid. And I feel like even though this is an all over yellow, green painting, there is a little bit of a sense of some horizontal and vertical marks or gestures. And that cool blue, violet, gray coming, contrasting the yellow and coming through in the center it creates an interesting sort of focal point in this color field. So kind of like what Katherine was saying about the piece, your work being open and also having a lot of entry points in the work because of the transparency of the layers and the process being evident. I think Albert has some of that as well. There's a sort of openness. And you can sort of meander. There's a lot, even though it's very subtle, like there's a lot of variation and texture and patina work, surface work that's in this series. Okay, moving on. This is Laura's other work.
Yeah, I think of this one as kind of evolved to be these figures in a landscape that still have these interventions like the X and these things that are sort of like non-space but maybe function as shadows. So with this one, I was thinking about this interplay of space and flatness and transparency or light, like these films that could kind of work to be covering something but also revealing it in this different way. None of my paintings are that big, but this is a larger than normal one for me. Maybe it's like 36 inches long. So it just became this kind of like field to play with all these different space and light effects on.
Yeah, it's interesting how you have that hard edge again, recurring element. It's like, it's very whimsical and free flowing, but then there's like a very sharp methodical intervention like this in this piece and in the other piece as well.
I feel like that's how my mind works, that it's always going back and forth between these kind of like emotions and intuitions, and then these
really technical, sharp,
technical or almost like second guessing myself in this way.
It's really intriguing. It's like such an intriguing combination because they're sometimes we think of those things as diametrically opposed, but here they're working in harmony, like the sort of super intuitive, loose, and then super precise, methodical.
Well, I really love the idea that light or color can integrate things that are separate. Like the way that light falls across something can make something harmonious that is actually like physically disparate items. So
that's a really interesting idea. And that again is, I mean, it's literally the reflection of light or the lack of reflection that's creating that shadow. Intriguing. Okay. Katherine?
Yes, so this was a little bit of an attempt to, I really wanted to blow up these identifiable figures like the leaf or a circle, so that it becomes almost abstract, or certainly more abstracted. And in doing that, I realized the scale shifts quite a lot. This piece is, 57 by 57. So I almost feel like I can walk into it a little bit more than some of my other pieces. And the other thing about this is it's much more declarative, I think, than a lot of my work. And it's also much less worked. I don't have, it's quicker. I don't have all of the same layers underneath. This actually adheres a little bit more to the sort of general composition that I had outlined initially. But it was a lot of fun to play with this magenta and the yellow, which is also not super usual for me. I tend to work more monochromatically.
And the title "Blowing Up, Paring Down" really is like it just describes your process for this piece. But it's interesting how like bold it is, but it's a segment or selection from some more exploratory image making, right? Like,
yeah, right.
So it maintains that the freshness. It doesn't feel like it doesn't have that rigid concreteness that you might have otherwise if you were to have just laid out the composition. I think you're able to translate some of the spontaneity of your process. Okay, interesting. And then this is one of the newest works from your
that's
time.
right. It's one of, if not the latest finished piece in my studio. Yeah.
Okay, great. And this is Elisa's.
Hi, this is called Aster Body and Leaf Pair. At the start of the pandemic, I started drawing a lot more, and was finding that it allowed me to have the time to go back to drawing and digest these like forms that I was making in sculpture. And so I started a series of pairs where I was putting side by side two figures and kind of bringing them together and relating these two kind of bodily forms, and creating this like archive of forms. Because in my sculpture, I often work with bodily fragments or portraits, and these are two that I've been going back to pretty often, and exploring these forms in the drawing, and then also making them in clay. And the drawing allowed me to like continue exploring these same forms, and as well as like them as having a conversation with each other, and as a like two people, but not really seeing them as like necessarily there being a narrative, but more kind of this like symbology of forms, and wanting to create this like archive of forms that I would keep going back to.
Nice. I like how the oil pastel translates the physicality of the clay so well. I've never thought of it as having that sort of sort of density or elasticity or an pliability. So it's nice.
Mhm.
It's nice to see that.
Yeah, I used to be an oil painter. It's
Yeah.
allowed me to still work with clay and then layer it a lot. Or I mean, work with paint, oil, oil pastel.
Nice. It's interesting too, these having been made during the pandemic, there is like this sense of like, is there a mask, or like how close are they, or like they're barely touching. I don't know if that's something that you were thinking about, but it comes through a little bit in the pairing. You know? Okay, great. Let me go next. And we saw this one. And Tom. Yeah, just unmute.
Yep. You can hear me now. Okay. Yeah, well, back to where we were before, the sound study, the imaginary form floating in a brine sound. Like, this is a larger of those smaller sound study pieces. This one's about 36 by, I guess 20. What, I don't know the exact. It's a little bit larger, 36 by 28, something like that. I usually work with horizontal, with vertical division in my, just because I think of them almost like staffs or bars, like kind of taking the nomenclature from scores. But this one I decided to try horizontal, and I really like it in that it's the same but different. It's a rhythm within a rhythm within a rhythm. And just that change from the horizontal to the horizontal from the vertical space makes such a flow kind of rhythmic difference. I really like this one. And I haven't done one since. I've gone kind of back to the more vertical thinking, but I really like this one for the weight of the horizontal division in there.
Yeah, and also the isometric perspectival proportions of the pink shape. Like it's interesting how it flips between being like 3D and 2D because of that.
Yeah, and I kind of play with the idea of like, is this a hole? Like, is this a cutout that you can step through, or is this like a solid object that's coming at you? It's kind of
Positive, negative. You have a color vibration because of its tonal relationship and color variation, and you also have that spatial flipping of positive, negative space.
yeah.
It electrifies the image, like you were talking about before. Interesting. Okay, Colin.
There's another small painting, 9 by 12, made in around the same time, I believe, with that one before. It was kind of a large group of paintings. And I guess most of mine paintings really have this kind of ambiguous moment of it could be creation or destruction. We're not sure what's happening. A lot of times it seems like something bad could be happening, but it also could be this kind of cathartic opening up moment. I feel like this one definitely has that. I use a sun or a star form or a light emitting form a lot, mostly because I feel like it's the most important thing that we have, and that without the stars there or the sun, we're not going to exist, right? And of course, in our current situations, it just seems to be more and more relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. It is interesting that you're it's almost like the landscape is a little acidic in this one, and that acidity could be either what you were saying, like growth, glowing warmth, or like destruction, but it's exciting.
Yeah, or some kind of otherworldly thing.
Yeah,
I think that's why I like to kind of go to the fluorescent side of things, the neon side of things. I always try to have that kind of keyed upness.
yeah, the colors. Mhm. There's a sort of beauty and like the disorienting.
Yeah.
at the same time. Are you using like a rag for some of them? I feel like there's this technique that Max Ernst used to do, put paint on glass.
I don't use a rag, but I do use kind of like a dry brush,
Okay.
and I do kind of smudge some. And it's funny, some my brushes become like beveled.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Stumbling on canvases. All of a sudden, they over like a few years, I have these ones that are like triangles,
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
I love those. You know,
yeah, really interesting brushwork, and the other one as well, like kind of super unusual marks. Interesting. Okay, and this is the first one. So I'm gonna stop the screen share and we'll just have a little conversation to close it out. I want to say thank you everyone for joining and being here for this and just participating in this kind of coming together and meeting each other and like having an artistic conversation through the work, and then also now in talking. And I was wondering if you guys could mention like things that are coming up, or how you're like, if you feel like there's been a major shift because of the pandemic. I think that's been really interesting for creative people to process. I just saw a really funny SNL skit yesterday about masks that my brother sent me. And it's like, it was funny because these people were coming together at a dinner party and everyone had these different ideas of how useful masks were and should they still wear them. But it was, to me, it reflected like the sort of uncertainty and slight PTSD of having lived through something like the pandemic and not being sure how to proceed exactly. Like, one of the parts was like, one of the actors was saying she'd gone to a kid's birthday party and like all the kids were wearing masks on the gym equipment, like it was at a gym, like a gymnastics place. But then they took off their masks to eat, and this sort of like, what's the right thing to do? And I feel like there's a sort of general quality of like a little unsteadiness. And I think the political situation that's happening right now contributes to that. But I'm wondering, as artists, like, do you feel that your work has changed a lot because of the pandemic, or that your perspective in your professions has changed? Or if you want to talk about something that's coming up, that would be great. But just kind of to close off the conversation with some final thoughts. And if you have questions for each other, that would be great too. You can put in the chat or just ask directly. Anybody who wants to go first, go ahead.
I'll address sort of the pandemic. I think that as a consequence of just going through so many different things, isolation, insecurity, a lot of overlap, a very, very few number of people, it's done a few things for me. One, I've started using brighter colors, like magenta and yellow have come into my work. And I used to work in black, white, grays, and blues, So I think that in a sense, this relates. I think it's freed me a little bit. And I think the color is part of that. It's also it's reinforced my commitment to art, and actually the necessity of art, because I think that sometimes I'll say, is it a little indulgent to be an artist? What role is this playing? And I feel like, and really quite specifically to the idea of the reflection theme of the show, that is absolutely necessary to take that time and to give that time and thought and beauty or transcendence or otherworldliness to other people. So I feel like I have a much easier time saying that now since all we've been through. Which for me is a really nice takeaway.
Yeah. Tom, what about you? Can you unmute?
Why will it not? Oh, did you mute me?
I
Host?
might have muted you by accident.
Oh, okay, yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, final thoughts. I mean, well, I'm gonna have a busy fall, which is exciting. Seems like there's there's the work in my studio, and then there's the art world work. I work in museums and things, so that's really starting to pick up again. So I'm kind of excited. I feel like life is slowly coming back to normal, but there's a new normal. I mean, that's the thing that, and I guess just thinking about what's been said already about going through the pandemic and stuff. How we go from, virus to bombs. It's just like, it's like we are in a time of perspective right now. It's pretty wild. And I actually have things going on in Prague in Eastern Europe, which is really Central Europe. So I'll be going, close to the action, so to speak. And and I have a lot of connections with that part of the world through family and stuff. So I'm excited to make work, and I think everything we do from now on is going to be more intense. It's just an intense time. So I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, thank you, Tom. Colin?
I mean, I think Catherine said it really nicely in that this time, of course, has been so trying for so many, but and it could be maybe start to seem self-indulgent to be an artist, like why are we doing this? But for me, it really has kind of pushed me maybe farther into this place of creativity, because it's a safe place for me, even though it's vulnerable too, and there's insecurities there and stuff, but it's a place where I can escape to, so that, of course, it was hard to make work, and during the height of the pandemic I felt a little bit guilty that I was enjoying myself or something while so much suffering was happening. So it made it kind of difficult to be making things. But I have some things coming up. There's a show this summer, Russell Janus, and that's going to be partly in Brooklyn and partly in Connecticut. And I'm not sure what I'm doing for that yet. So that's a nice, there's a suitcase or something involved. I don't know. So that's an exciting piece to do something different, get out of my comfort zone a little bit. Releasing a solo record, hopefully this summer, that I've been working on for the last 2 years, that I've recorded here all by my lonesome. So that's exciting, and just to keep trying to be productive.
Nice. What about you, Laura?
Well, I'm still processing the effect the pandemic has had on. I don't know. I feel like I don't know. I just started teaching in person again after 2 years teaching on Zoom. So I'm thinking a lot about that. And we were able to go see and talk about artwork in person. And I was just really struck by how much more we were able to think about material and that really dynamic sense of being in person with something. It was really heartening to be in person. I guess I am worried about how much artwork is getting flattened to an image, this kind of only an image on a screen. But in a lot of ways, the pandemic was helpful to me. I had a baby this summer, and I had a difficult pregnancy, and that all hit at the same time, like this whole process that everything was locking down, like I would have been totally isolated anyway. And it allowed me to work remotely, which I wouldn't have been able to do. I would have had to probably quit my job. So that's been very consuming right now.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, the sort of working on your own or by yourself or being with your own thoughts during the pandemic was really crazy making. But I think for artists, we seek out that time. It's like, yes,
Yeah.
more of the cocooning and reflect, like, I think it's very hard for us to get bored with our own company. That's kind of the central part of being a practicing artist, is that you're in your own company. But it is interesting how life kind of sort of matches up, your needs and path and stuff for, everyone here. And it made your experience more possible. Like you were balancing a lot, and it sort of helped unify energies and space and stuff. And congratulations on your beautiful new baby also.
Thank you.
Okay, Brian, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I really resonated with what Katherine said and what Laura just said, especially. It's been a very strange. I mean, this coming after years of political nightmare, and then dropped into this, and I frankly found it both very difficult and also I feel very grateful for a lot of things that happened during this time. I found it quite difficult to work for the first part of it. The anxiety, dealing with death and deaths, family and people I know and friends and so on. And it wasn't all COVID, but there seemed to be a lot of death everywhere you looked, and dealing with one's own, put your nose right in your own mortality and fear. And so it brought up a lot of pretty intense stuff. Some of which, you asked if it's really changed the work. I don't know that at this point. I don't know. Probably looking back, I will probably understand that some of the work's transmuting some of that kind of feeling of trauma and fear. And something that I think that's really important, Katherine spoke about is the sort of crisis of, I know I experienced something about this a lot, actually, this kind of crisis of value and meaning in what one does. And I noticed that there's, in the current and other crises that are going on, this artists shaming other artists about, talking about their art instead of, kind of talking about what the crisis is about. And I feel like there's something off on that, because I think that what we do is actually really deeply, profoundly important, and actually is a kind of, ultimately is a kind of, can be a pointing to a direction, or can even provide a certain kind of guidance. And honestly, when you think about it, there's been a lot of unbelievably great art that has been created in the world during times of terrible crisis. I mean, just horrifying crisis. And people that were actually living it and going through it were making during those times. So I don't think this is a frivolous thing that we do. So I don't know. It's just brought a lot of gravity to it all in another kind of a way. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, someone posted when I was posting about this talk coming up, like, something about, and meanwhile in the Ukraine, and it was, I think this idea, like there's a lot of social flexing, and like that your personal agenda should be like sort of represent some sort of social ideal or ideal platform. But I think that that art, because it's not a totally one-to-one ratio of what it is and what it's for, like it's not a functional practical activity, like, you know, making a piece of furniture or bread or whatever. It's not a direct consumable like that. It's, I think, because we're in such a heightened capitalist state, with, you know, lifestyle and wealth aspiration, that because it's an activity that doesn't translate into a capitalist logic, there's this real like challenge to a paradigm that's built around wealth and money. So I think it's on two fronts. It's like it doesn't translate into what its purpose or function is the way a lot of other production does, and it doesn't directly result in wealth the way a lot of people's jobs may, or their other career endeavors. But you know, there's a huge, the Great Resignation has happened or is still happening, and I think people are really questioning their jobs, the purpose, like, you know, what's their life purpose and how they're spending their energy. And I just want to point out, there's this theorist, an art historian, Alain de Bottin, that writes about art as therapy for both the artists making it and for the viewer, not in a sort of medical therapeutical way, but just as a sort of catharsis, fulfilling like a sort of lack, or you know, you seek out something that you need. There's this kind of healing quality to it. So I think even though we don't kind of generally have that language, definitely is an interesting way to see it. And that's not including a lot of Eastern traditions that see art making as a spiritual practice, as a form of prayer, which is also really intriguing and can be translated in a secular way as well. Elisa, I'd love to hear from you too.
There have been sort of, I think several phases of the pandemic. Like initially I was working in the studio, but in shorter spurts and with my son Jonas. So it was sort of like divided attention, and then as it progressed and kids went back to school, I was able to have a little bit more time, and then slowed down a bit and had more time to be with the work and reflect. And and it also allows me to draw more, and that's been a really great thing, I think, to have that back in my practice and have space for that.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to say thank you very much. It's already 9, so I'm going to close it up. And thank you for participating and being part of the conversation. And I look forward to seeing what everybody continues to make and do. And yeah, so I'll just sign off and say bye for now.
Thanks, Katherine. This was really fun. I was hearing everyone talk about that.
Katerina.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Joe.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.